I guess I started out like lots of artists do, wanting to change the world. And I realised over time that changing the world's quite difficult to do, but that perhaps what I could do was to create the conditions for change. And in trying to create the conditions for change, I started to look at values, how we can work with and how we live with our values. And as I did that, I was aware there was something that came before values, something that enabled us to engage with our values in relation to others and in relation to issues, quite complex issues. And that I thought was perhaps empathy. So I decided I'd do some work around empathy, which is what I've been doing this year. And the more I've learnt, the more I'm convinced that empathy is the gateway to creating the conditions for change, behaviour change, to engaging with bigger issues through our connection with each other. And yeah, to finding ways through some of the most complex problems of our time.
Well, what is empathy to you? Because I've heard it understood in different ways. What is your understanding of it?
I guess, we can talk about lots of different aspects of empathy, but I guess in terms of the work I do as an artist, what I'm interested in is that space that empathy creates between people. And it's a space of possibility, it's a space of relationship, and it's a space of holding in mind an other or others. And inevitably, the result of that is that we start to pull back perhaps on our own desires, on our own entrenched positions, and to move into a place where perhaps we can start to think about plurality, which I think is also a very important part of change.
It sounds, in a simple way, to do with a different kind of listening almost. Does that come into it? Because people seem to be very bad at listening and hearing each other.
Absolutely. Empathy, and it's why it's very important as a creative artist, a live artist, empathy is very important, because empathy, the ingredients of it are active listening, paying close attention, really, really thinking about somebody else to the extent that we can begin to predict what they might do and feel the impact of their actions on ourselves. So it's absolutely the state that as an artist I've been striving for. I've wanted for a long time to understand how to create an active audience. And empathy is an active listening, an active being with another.
Hello, I'm Mark.
And I'm Murray.
And we're here to tell you about the word empathy.
Empathy, yes, empathy.
Empathy. We are actually wired, soft-wired to experience empathic distress of another.
It all begins with empathy.
Empathy.
I've thought a lot about the power of empathy in my work.
I'm talking about an empathy deficit. The inability to recognize ourselves in one another.
So it's a word we're used to hearing, but what exactly is it? We know that from the moment we're born, we're hardwired for empathy, learning fast, mirroring everything that we see around us, learning how to be, how to do, who we are. We know that during the course of our lives, we continue to learn through our empathic connection with others, developing our skills and our relationships. We know that through our empathic connection, our emotions are contagious, more swiftly catching than any virus, enabling us to feel physically another person's pain. And we know we can turn that painful connection into a gift that we can give. And we know how giving and receiving that deep gift of understanding can change lives for a moment, for a day, or forever. We know that we can be so deeply connected that our brains become as one, enabling us to do so much more in the world than we can do alone. We know that it enables us to really be there for those we love, and even for people we will never meet. People whose lives stretch out into a future that we'll never be part of.
It sounds quite political in one way and also quite therapeutic in another way. And you're not a politician, you're not a therapist, and it's something there, though, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if we talk about therapy, then we're talking about the individual and the place of the individual in society, which is really where theatre begins. Watching others and watching them in positions and considering them in relation to ourselves. And then if we think about politics, politics is about the bigger issues, the human. And really, if you look back to Greek tragedies and Shakespeare and all those classic plays, it's about considering the individual and the individual's relationship to the greater aspects of humanity, be they political problems or be they, just understanding of life's tragedies. So absolutely, I think empathy helps us to engage at different levels of being, from the personal to the communal, through a sort of activating of that communal to the greatest and perhaps political, economic challenges.
We tend to use the word empathy, or people do, as a good thing. But can't some people who have a lot of understanding or insight into others use it for bad purposes?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did some work recently for a radio play looking at advertising and empathy. And when I talked to advertisers about empathy or about mirror neurons, they didn't really understand. And then eventually they said, "Oh, you're talking about emotional advertising." And I said, "Well, why are you doing emotional advertising now?" And they said, "Oh, it's the recession. People don't have a lot of money, so we have to look at things like loyalty, which loyalty and loyalty cards are very, they're very much in our minds, aren't they? That word loyalty has different connotations today. So absolutely, advertisers are seeing, once we understand that our decisions are not made rationally, our decisions are initially made in an embodied emotional way, then of course everybody's going to jump on the bandwagon, and advertisers are doing that. You just only have to look at the John Lewis Christmas adverts, and I think we have to then become wise to some of those machinations.
And also, I mean, one of the other things is if you are a pretty empathetic person in a positive sense, as a general rule, and you yourself use the word kind at certain points, if you are generally a kind, loving person, is there a danger that if you come up against somebody who isn't being very empathetic or who is being very aggressive, that something goes wrong in that interchange and you become not just vulnerable in a good sense, but simply victimized?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's very much the case, that if you are compassionate and kind and always try to stay in that place of empathy, then it can leave you in a very vulnerable position. And so then it's important to recognize that different behavior. And Christian Keyes, the neuroscientist, talks about that empathy, that space of possibility, but that if it's not reciprocated, then we need to move out of that space. And that's very hard, I think, if you're an empathic person. And I suppose for me, I've had those experiences in my life, and I have found it very difficult, and it can be very de-energizing and it can be very breaking. But actually, you do need to pull back and hold that kindness, the altruism back in yourself, and really leave go and let that other person take away, those things with them, rather than holding that in yourself. And that's true to an extent, I think, of when you're working in situations of burnout, whether that's campaigning or in the healthcare system or the education system. That in those situations, we also have to be very careful and aware of the boundaries that we need in order to empathise in a way that isn't going to destroy us.
So you have to be empathetic to yourself as well as the other, is that what you mean?
Absolutely. And then we do move into more therapeutic territory of being able to nurture ourselves and understanding that empathy is a two-way street, really. And if it's not coming back in equal doses to how it's being given, then we perhaps need to just carefully adjust and take note of that.
One thing that struck me is that sometimes people are very empathic because they have had very bad experiences and they're extra sensitive. And I'm just thinking of people who have had to be able to read people because they have been abused or because they're refugees or whatever the situation is, because they have had dangerous things happen to them. Could you say something about how such people use empathy, or how other people might view that anxiety, if you like?
Yeah, and this is something I've observed a lot, and it's something I discussed with Christian Keysers, that the same people, even within a family, can go through the same situation and react in very different ways, perhaps becoming very tender, as you describe, or choosing to shut down. And it's impossible to work out quite exactly why those things happen. But I think for those people who take that route of becoming tender, there is a real journey of understanding how that empathy not only can be given but can be received. Because I think sometimes if we're used to empathizing because empathy is something that we need, we forget to also find it for ourselves, which is why sometimes I think those people can end up in situations where they're giving out care but haven't really learnt how to feel it in return, I guess.
That's really interesting. One thing you talked about, I thought was really interesting too, about the generations and the kind of assumption in some people that maybe it gets less and less as the generations go on. Mightn't it be, as you seem to suggest with some of the people, the reverse? Because in a way, with your own children, there's so much baggage, of the difficulties you had as a parent trying to learn how to be a parent, whereas with a grandchild or a great-grandchild, you only have the good bits, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting. And I don't have great grandchildren. I don't know, but absolutely, I can imagine the purity of that connection. That could be very beautiful. But then, if we look at the way we live in society, we don't behave as though we care for our great grandchildren and their children and their children. We mine the future. And we downgrade it economically. And while there are people, young people out there investing in difficult lives to create better futures, I think we have to consider our responsibility as miners of the future, which essentially we are.
So you didn't talk tonight about things like climate change particularly, but it is something that you have been very involved with. How do you relate empathy to climate change?
Climate change, the issues in communicating climate change have really boiled down to a difficulty in space and time. It's distant from us, and we could say that's a problem of empathy. And also the fact that it's been communicated in informational terms, so through the science, through the facts, communicating to our rational brains. So my journey, and I've worked very much with climate change over the last decade, has been about saying, well, if the science doesn't work, then we need to find ways of embodying that. And once you start to look at embodying, you then start to think about, okay, if these people are distant from us in space and time, how do we concertina space and time? How do we bring it closer to us? So really I think it's about making that experience close to us, close to our embodied emotional selves. Not in a manipulative way, but in a way that creates a space that people can inhabit, that loses our feeling of threat, fear and distance, and lets us really see close up what those issues might be.
Do you think we're going to make it in time before irreversibility sets in?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to know where that point of irreversibility is. I feel, an urgency to be getting on with it, and certainly the work I do reflects that. I don't think we're not going to stay below 2 degrees. I think we're in an adaptation model already, and then the challenge becomes, well, are we adapting, or are we going to slip towards 4 degrees, at which point we're living in a chaotic world. So yeah, I guess it's how much can we adapt before it's too late.
What ways of talking, what kinds of language have you found are sterile, and what forms of language have you found are fertile?
I think my work is on the borders between lots of things. So I work a lot with charities, with campaigners, activists, with scientists. And I've found that actually that information, the facts, are really, really useful. But they're useful when they're juxtaposed with the specific, the human, the personal, the felt. And I think the borders between things, just as we talk about empathy being about connections, I think those nodes of connection between material are where we can find the most potent communication and interaction.
And do you feel that the public, the general public, which hasn't really had that much voice, we've heard the media rather downplay, very much downplay this, or ignore it altogether. We've heard the politicians, unfortunately, do the same, even when behind the scenes they're sometimes more positive. but the public is hardly anywhere. There, you know, occasional people like yourselves and others popping up, and we all know each other, but it's not generally known. What can the public do, and how can people like yourselves reach the wider public?
In terms of climate change?
Yes. Or in terms of change to a fairer, greener world generally.
So systemic.
Yes,
how do we achieve
exactly,
systemic change?
Exactly.
Well, you know, I think a lot of artists and campaigners, sort of, we beat ourselves up over the fact that we haven't yet changed the world. And I guess it's for me about creating the conditions for change. That's where I've arrived at. And I feel about creating the conditions for change is about multiplicity. It's about a multiplicity of ideas and stories that different people can bring to that, so not telling people how to be. And also a multiplicity of offerings in terms of arts and campaigning actions. So I feel myself more and more to be part of a community of change makers who are out there offering spaces for people in which they can start to begin to consider change. And of course that's very, very hard to record, it's very, very hard to see the effects of it. But I know from the work I've done that it is long-reaching and it is profound. And I guess we reach then a point of critical mass where enough people have come into enough contact with enough thinking that we can start to tip over into something better.
This is very general, so if I could maybe end by asking you for something personal that has changed in your life perhaps, to do with empathy, and which will have a ripple effect, you know, onto the world, or your corner of the world, or the bigger world, whatever you
So
like.
do you mean something that's happened in my personal life particularly?
Yes.
I think being the parent of teenage children, you know, I've shifted from, you know, having children who I can send to their room if I want to and discuss things with, and they operate within the home environment, to a situation where I'm the parent of teenagers who really are going to do what they want to do and are striving for independence in ways that perhaps I haven't considered and might find frightening or difficult. And that has really challenged me to retain my empathy and to consider, really take on the viewpoint of another, even when they're doing things that I find difficult and frightening. And I think that test and the way that, particularly my relationship with my eldest daughter who's 17, the way we've come through that has really taught me that empathy can get us through the hardest of times, and that actually communicating, keeping those lines of communication open in times of conflict is our best bet.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
It was a wonderful show and lovely to hear you talking now as well. Thank you.
Thank you.